It all started with a road trip that was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Chris and Jenna, a young couple fresh out of college, decided to drive cross-country before settling into their new jobs. The open road, countless diners, and roadside attractions were calling to them. They packed their car with snacks, a playlist of their favorite songs, and a map, though they relied more on their GPS. The journey began smoothly. They drove through picturesque landscapes, stopping at quirky landmarks and taking photos to document their trip. But as the days went by, their path veered into less populated areas. The roads grew narrower, the signs faded, and the scenery became eerily repetitive. Rolling hills, dense forests, and the occasional abandoned gas station. It was the third night when things started to feel off. They had planned to stay at a motel in a small town about 50 miles away, but the GPS led them down a long, empty highway instead. No lights, no other cars, just the endless stretch of road illuminated by their headlights. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Jenna asked, glancing nervously at the dark forest lining both sides of the road. Chris nodded, though he didn't sound confident. "The GPS says we'll be there in 20 minutes. Maybe it's just a shortcut." Jenna didn't argue, but her unease grew. The radio, which had been playing static for miles, suddenly cut out entirely. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of trees in the wind. She tried to find a station, but the dial spun uselessly. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a figure on the side of the road. It was a man, standing perfectly still. His clothes were tattered, and his face was pale, almost glowing in the headlights. He didn't stick out his thumb or wave. He simply stared at them as they passed. His hollow eyes locked onto Jenna's, sending a shiver down her spine. "Did you see that guy?" she whispered. "Yeah," Chris replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Should we stop?" "No," Jenna said quickly. "Just keep going." They drove on in silence, but the tension in the car was palpable. Jenna kept glancing in the side mirrors, half expecting to see the man chasing after them, but the road remained empty. A few minutes later, they passed another figure. This one was a woman, wearing a torn dress. She looked even worse than the man. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, and her skin unnaturally pale. Like the first figure, she didn't move, didn't signal for help. She just stood there, watching them. "What the hell is going on?" Chris muttered. His hands were trembling now. "Just keep driving," Jenna whispered. "Don't stop for anything." The GPS announced they were 10 minutes away from their destination, but the road stretched on endlessly. The forest seemed to close in around them, and the air grew thick and suffocating. Then they saw the third figure. It was a child this time, a little boy in tattered clothes, standing in the middle of the road. Chris slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt just a few feet away from the boy. But when they looked up, the road was empty. The boy had vanished. "I'm turning around," Chris said, his voice shaking. He tried to make a U-turn, but as soon as the car spun around, the headlights revealed the man, the woman, and the boy standing together in the middle of the road. Their faces were blank, their eyes black pits. "Drive!" Jenna screamed. Chris hit the gas, but the car didn't move. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them stranded in the dark. The figures began to move toward the car, their motions jerky and unnatural, like puppets on strings. Jenna fumbled with her phone, but there was no signal. "What do we do?" she cried. Chris grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. "Stay here. I'll see if I can—" "No, don't go out there," Jenna shouted. But it was too late. Chris was already outside, shining the flashlight toward the figures. They were gone. "Chris, get back in the car," Jenna begged, but he didn't listen. He took a few steps down the road, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The flashlight flickered and then went out. Jenna heard Chris scream, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the night. She scrambled out of the car, yelling his name, but he was gone. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Panicking, she climbed back into the car and locked the doors. She tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around, hoping for any sign of Chris. Then in the rearview mirror, she saw the figures. They were standing behind the car, staring at her. The boy's face was pressed against the back window, his black eyes boring into hers. She screamed and flung the door open, running down the road as fast as she could. The forest seemed endless, and no matter how far she ran, the figures were always just behind her. Their hollow voices echoed in her mind, whispering words she couldn't understand. Jenna's legs gave out, and she collapsed on the side of the road. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the boy's pale, expressionless face. When she woke up, it was daylight. She was lying in a ditch on the side of a highway, her clothes torn and dirty. A passing truck driver found her and called the police. Chris was never found, the car was gone, and the stretch of road she described didn't exist on any map. To this day, Jenna refuses to drive at night. She says the figures are still out there waiting for their next victim on the endless highway. The open highway stretched endlessly before them as Daniel and Mia sped along in their old, beat-up sedan. The couple was returning from a week-long camping trip in the mountains, eager to get home before nightfall. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "This shortcut better be worth it," Mia said, eyeing the GPS skeptically. "This road looks like it hasn't seen a car in years." Daniel chuckled. "It's fine. Trust me, we'll save at least an hour this way." But as the miles rolled on, the road became more desolate. The trees lining the highway seemed taller and denser, their branches reaching out like claws. The silence was unsettling. Even the usual hum of crickets and rustling leaves was absent. It wasn't long before they spotted him. A man stood on the shoulder of the road, his thumb outstretched in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a long coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Mia tensed. "Don't stop." Daniel slowed the car. "He might need help. Look at him. He's in the middle of nowhere." "Exactly," Mia hissed. "Why is he out here? It's creepy. Just keep going." But Daniel was already pulling over. The hitchhiker approached the car with slow, deliberate steps. When he reached the window, Daniel rolled it down slightly. "Need a ride?" Daniel asked. The hitchhiker leaned in, and Mia's stomach turned. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. When he spoke, his voice was deep and gravelly. "Thank you," he said simply, opening the back door and climbing in without waiting for an invitation. Mia glared at Daniel, but he ignored her. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," the hitchhiker replied. "I'll let you know where to stop." Mia felt a shiver run down her spine. She turned to glance at him, but quickly looked away. Something about his presence was unnerving, almost suffocating. As they drove, the hitchhiker remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The tension in the car was palpable. Mia fiddled with the radio, desperate to fill the silence, but only static came through. Finally, Daniel spoke. "So, What brings you out here?" The hitchhiker didn't respond at first. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You should turn back." Daniel frowned. "What?" "This road," the hitchhiker said slowly, "isn't safe. It's not what it seems." Mia's grip tightened on the armrest. "What do you mean?" The hitchhiker leaned forward slightly, his pale face illuminated by the dashboard lights. "There's a gas station up ahead. Stop there and don't go any further. No matter what you see, don't leave the station until morning." Daniel laughed nervously. "You're kidding, right?" The hitchhiker didn't laugh. He sat back, his shadowed face unreadable. "You'll see." The words sent a chill through Mia. She glanced at the GPS. It still showed a clear path to their destination. But as they approached the gas station, the hitchhiker suddenly spoke again. "Stop here." Daniel pulled into the station, a dimly lit building with flickering neon lights. The hitchhiker opened the door and stepped out. Before he closed it, he leaned in one last time. "Stay here. Don't leave until sunrise. If you don't, they'll come for you." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows. Mia turned to Daniel. "We're not staying here. This guy's nuts." But as Daniel turned the key to start the car, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again and again, but the car refused to start. "What the hell?" he muttered, slamming the steering wheel. Mia looked around nervously. The gas station was eerily quiet, with no attendant in sight. "Maybe we should wait," she said reluctantly. Hours passed and the darkness outside seemed to grow thicker, almost alive. Shadows moved in the periphery of their vision, and strange sounds echoed from the forest surrounding the station. Low whispers, distant footsteps, and the occasional high-pitched wail. At 3 a.m., Daniel couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going to find help," he said, opening the door. "Are you crazy?" Mia grabbed his arm. "That guy said not to leave." Daniel shook her off. "He was just some weirdo. We can't sit here all night." He stepped outside and the door slammed shut behind him. Mia watched him disappear into the darkness, her heart pounding. Minutes turned into hours, and Daniel didn't return. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, and Mia stepped out of the car, calling Daniel's name. There was no response. She walked around the gas station, searching, but found no sign of him. Then she saw the hitchhiker standing at the edge of the forest, his face as pale as ever. He tipped his hat and said, "I warned you." When Mia looked back at the car, it was gone. Only the empty highway remained. It was supposed to be a bonding trip. 3 childhood friends, Mark, Eleanor, and Jake, set out on a road trip to relive their carefree days. They packed their cars with camping gear, snacks, and a sense of adventure, planning to spend the weekend exploring a remote national park. Mark led the convoy in his old Jeep, with Elena and Jake following in a black SUV. They drove for hours, laughing over the radio and reminiscing about old times. The roads grew narrower as they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the dense forest swallowing the sunlight. As dusk approached, Mark pulled over at a fork in the road. The GPS showed 2 options: a longer, paved route or a shorter, unmarked path cutting through the woods. "We'll save at least an hour if we take this shortcut," Mark said over the radio. Elena hesitated. "Are you sure? It doesn't even look like a real road." Jake chimed in, his voice crackling through the speaker. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? Let's do it." Reluctantly, Elena agreed, and they turned onto the narrow dirt path. The forest closed in around them, the trees so thick they blocked out the remaining daylight. The air grew cooler, and an eerie silence settled over the convoy. It wasn't long before they noticed something strange. "Do you see that?" Elena said over the radio. "There's no one else out here, but it feels like we're being watched." Mark laughed nervously. "You're just freaking yourself out. It's probably animals or something." But as they drove on, the feeling only intensified. Shadows flickered in the trees, and strange shapes seemed to dart just out of sight. The dirt road twisted and turned, with no end in sight. Then came the headlights. Elena was the first to notice them. A pair of bright white beams appeared in her rearview mirror, far in the distance. "Guys, there's someone behind us." Mark glanced in his mirror. "Maybe it's a local. Let's keep moving." The headlights drew closer, but the vehicle remained a shadowy blur. Elena's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "They're driving way too fast." The lights surged forward, tailgating Elena's SUV. She honked, but the car didn't back off. Instead, it swerved violently, trying to force her off the road. "Mark, do something!" she screamed. Mark slammed on his brakes, letting Elena and Jake pass him. The headlights stopped suddenly, as if frozen in place. For a moment, the convoy halted, their engines idling in tense silence. Then the lights vanished. "What the hell was that?" Jake said, his voice trembling. Mark shook his head. "I don't know. Let's just keep moving." They drove on, the tension in the cars palpable. The dirt road seemed to stretch endlessly, with no signs, no landmarks, just an oppressive wall of trees on either side. The hours dragged on, and the forest grew darker, the air heavier. At midnight, the radio crackled. "Guys, my car's acting weird," Jake said, "the engine's sputtering." Before anyone could respond, Jake's SUV rolled to a stop. Mark and Elena pulled over, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They got out and walked back to Jake's car. "It's dead," Jake said, slamming the hood in frustration. "I don't get it. I just had it serviced." Mark frowned. "Let's try jumping it." As they worked on the car, the forest seemed to press closer. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, low guttural growls and high-pitched cries that didn't belong to any animal they knew. Elena glanced around nervously, the flashlight in her hand trembling. Then they saw the lights. This time, there were 3 pairs of headlights, approaching from the direction they had come. They were blindingly bright, cutting through the darkness with unnatural intensity. "We need to go," Elena whispered. Mark nodded. "Jake, leave the car. We'll come back for it later." They piled into Mark's Jeep, and he sped off, leaving the SUV behind. The headlights followed, gaining on them with terrifying speed. No matter how fast Mark drove, the lights stayed close, their beams piercing through the Jeep's rear window. "They're toying with us," Jake muttered, his face pale. Then the lights disappeared. The road ahead was pitch black, the forest eerily quiet. Mark slowed the car, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Did we lose them?" Elena shook her head. "I don't think so. They're still out there." Suddenly the headlights reappeared, not behind them but ahead. They were impossibly close, cutting off the road entirely. Mark slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The Jeep plowed into a blinding wall of light, and everything went white. When Elena woke up, she was alone. The Jeep was gone, along with Mark and Jake. The dirt road was overgrown with weeds, as if it hadn't been used in decades. Her phone had no signal, and the forest around her was deathly silent. Stumbling through the woods, she eventually found a ranger's station. When she told her story, the ranger's face went pale. "That road's been closed for years," he said. "There's no way you drove down it." But Elena knew what she had seen. Somewhere in that endless forest, the convoy was still driving, pursued by the ghostly headlights of the vanished cars, and they would never escape.